Welcome, Booknerds, and of course, another Facebook Live session. And we have a wonderful author with us again. And when non-fiction books and authors come on the Booknerds podcast and the live sessions, I'm super excited because this is my first love. Of course, we do all kinds of genres, but non-fiction, again, they are always special. And today we are going to discuss this book. It's called Princestan, and we'll delve deeper. And of course, the author is with us, Mr. Sandeep Bamzai. And so, welcome to the Book Nerds podcast and this live session first. Thank you so much for taking time out.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. So, a little bit about Mr. Bamzai, who don't know about him, and I mean, I would be kind of surprised if you are at all related with media or consume media that you don't know about him. But still, our listeners and of course the book lovers would love to know more about him. He's a news junkie, as he states very clearly, and that's a great thing to know. He has worked in this industry, the media industry, for around 37 years. He's a stalwart. Sir, congratulations on that great
Thanks.
journey.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, and you name it. I mean, you have been with the best publishers there out there, and of course, you have written some more books other than Princestan. You have written Guts and Glory, the Bombay cricket story, because you started with the Statesman as a cricket writer, and it was quite surprising for me because this genre, I mean, it's quite a departure. And deconstructing the Accession, Bonfire of Kashmiriyat. Now, I mean, I started, kind of realizing what this journey has paved the way to this book, of course. And meanwhile, Mr. Bamzai has worked with the Indian Express, Illustrated Weekly, Business India, and right now the editor-in-chief at IANS. So, sir, of course, Princestan was quite a revelation for me, first of all, because as we were discussing just before the session, that the history that we ICSC, ISC students and CBSC students have read and have been exposed to, it's quite superficial. I can say, I don't know if I'm right or not, but this was like a deep dive into all of that. I mean, I remember just one chapter on independence, and that's about it. So this was like, I was okay. I mean, there was so much going on and for so long. So, first of all, congratulations on this deeply researched book. And I'm not just saying it because it's really a lot of research. Of course, you have been helped with some, kind of material which came in through the family, of course. We'll talk
So,
about that. So, yeah, enough about me. Tell me how this book happened, first of all, then we'll delve deeper.
okay, so this is actually the culmination, or well, culmination would not be the right word. This is a pit stop in a journey, because you mentioned deconstructing the Accession, Bonfire of Kashmiriyat. That I would reckon was the first in a series of what I believe will be a trilogy. That happened in 2006. But again, as you mentioned, I'm a professional journalist, so one hardly gets the time. And if you're in a senior editorial position, particularly like me, if I've been holding senior editorial positions for the most part, it's very difficult to get away and write a book. Because it requires a different kind of discipline. It requires time to yourself. It requires research. It requires, for instance, in this book, I spent a lot of time at the Nehru Memorial Museum. I was also fortunate in that ORF gave me a fellowship. So at the National Archives, again, I spent some time. If you're editing a newspaper, or you're on television in a senior editorial position, you simply can't get away. So both times, or actually every time that I've done a book, it's required a sabbatical. This one took longer because the research was really sort of a regimen that I began to follow, because it's all very well to be bequeathed with papers, documents, but there are no notes. So to corroborate every single piece of whatever is available as research material is a very difficult task. All told, it probably took me 3 years, and while I couldn't stay on a sabbatical for 3 years. So I started working again. I took a sabbatical of almost a year from when I finished with Mail Today as the editor and Profit Center head. And then I took some time off, about a year. ORF was kind enough. Beyond that, once again, I became the editor-in-chief of Financial Chronicle. So one began to work again. And it's been a long, arduous road to complete it. And then, as luck would have it, COVID happened. And that actually delayed the process of release. And then finally we got around to releasing it. This, I think, is an important contribution to Indian history. I'll tell you why. You mentioned ICSE, CBSE, and I have gone through the same ICSE, ISC sort of route. I don't think there's enough done in our country vis-a-vis Freedom Archives. I don't think we have the necessary... I don't think we spent enough time to look at what happened in the independence movement. And the independence movement is a long, drawn-out process. It's not a matter of a few years. I chose this selectively because when I was writing Bonfire of Kashmiriyat, in all those papers, I found strands and nuggets which seemed to suggest that there was virtually a rebellion and an armed, well, maybe not an armed insurrection, but there was virtually a rebellion amongst the princes not to come forward and join the new ideal and idea of India that our founding fathers had, people like Nehru, people like Patel. And it is through that, reading through those papers, documents, missive, private and confidential letters, that I realized that there was so much going on. And it's only then, and it's taken me, 2006 and then again 2020, which means that after 14 years, I wrote my next book. My first book I wrote in 97, the second I wrote in 2001, the one that you mentioned, Bombay Cricket Story, Guts and Glory. Then again, 2006, which is all right, but it's taken me 14 long years. And this book particularly has taken me almost 3 years to write. And I think it's vital to understand that not only are there so many more invisible, faceless people who contributed to this freedom and independence, but equally there are these heavy hitters who we are all familiar with, but their contribution per se and the amount of work that they put in to create a unified India. Let's understand, there are 18 provinces and there are 565 princes. The princes refused to join India. And that is the genesis of this book, that when Mountbatten on July 25th, 1947, announced that to the princes, and he gave them a shellacking. He was in his complete regalia as Lord Louis, Earl of Mountbatten, and he gave these princes who had gathered there before him a shellacking. And he told them categorically that please understand that there are only two dominions. You have to choose between the two. One is Pakistan and the other is Hindustan or India, as it were. But the princes from 1944, 1943 along the way conspired repeatedly to ensure that a third dominion called Princestan would be created as a separate entity. And this Nehru, Patel and Mountbatten would certainly not permit. And that is the premise of the book. And I think more needs to be done as far as Freedom Archives, independence, the history around India's independence is concerned. More needs to be done as far as all this is concerned.
And I mean, you have taken a lot of time, but I mean, you are a film junkie. I read somewhere, I don't know, on Facebook or somewhere.
I am.
Understand my what I'm about to say. I mean, James Cameron took like ages to make some of his movies. I mean, it doesn't matter actually. It's the content. If it's good, I mean,
absolutely.
So on page 58, you have mentioned, and this is Lord Mountbatten at the conclusion of their first interview after arriving in India with
Yeah.
Nehru. And Mr. Nehru, I want you to regard me not as the last viceroy winding up the British Raj, but as the first to lead the way to the new India. And then the follow-up quote is Nehru's reply. Now I know what they mean when they speak of your charm being so dangerous. It is like, these things, I mean, it's great that you have revived all this. Of course, there is so much more that is there. But tell me the relationship that kind of, this team of Patel, Mountbatten, Nehru, and of course, there were other players, as you mentioned. How was it working as a good, well-oiled machine?
So you have to understand, Mountbatten arrived in India on March 22nd, 1947.
Yeah.
And India attained independence on August 15, Pakistan on August 14. Wow. So he's abbreviated history because the original timeline that Mountbatten gave was June 30th, 1948. Yeah. So he's done this, dusted it, and moved on.
Yeah.
Now, the same Mountbatten came in 1921. Okay. As the ADC to the Prince of Wales at that particular time, King, who ultimately became King Edward, King Edward. Yeah. So a lot of these princes, the big princes, people like Nawab of Bhopal, the Maharaja of Bikaner, the Nizam, who actually managed to get for himself a title like His Exalted Highness from the British Crown, which is a stupendous achievement at that time. Yeah. A majority of these big princes had actually interfaced and interacted with the same Mountbatten in 1921. Right. So they actually thought of Mountbatten, who had been replaced by Clement Attlee, and Lord Wavell had been recalled. Yeah. They actually thought that he would be a friend to them.
Yes.
They actually thought that he would actually help them, support them in their endeavor to create a Princestan. Yeah. They were shocked at this July 25 shellacking. I mean, he just blitzed them with his speech, and the Nawab of Bhopal actually felt betrayed at the end of that July 25 speech, and he said that Mountbatten had betrayed the princes because people like Nawab of Bhopal, Hamidullah Khan, believed that under paramountcy and the law of treaties, etc., they were invincible, and India would become independent with those 18 provinces, and these guys would continue to, through the crown, through their connection to the crown, British crown, they would continue to remain independent or whatever. Yeah. So it was a huge setback for obviously these princes on July 25. Yeah. But now to put things in context, when Mountbatten arrived on March 22nd, he spent a lot of time interviewing the key dramatis personae or the principles of that time. So he held individual meetings with Mahatma Gandhi, with Pandit Nehru, with Sardar Patel, with Muhammad Ali Jinnah, to understand the lay of the land, to understand what exactly was happening. And there is another conversation which I have referred to, where Nehru, on his arrival, soon after his arrival in one of those private chats, asks Mountbatten, do you have plenipotentiary powers? Yeah. And Mountbatten smiled and said, yes. So Nehru understood that here was a decolonizer. Yeah. Here was the man who would put the British sun, which never set, excuse me, he will actually be responsible for the setting of the British, the sun of the British Empire. Yeah. So these conversations were vital, and for Mountbatten to understand and gauge every personality and every, to figure out who was doing what and where each individual was placed, these conversations were vital. And that is the bedrock of actually the run-up to the independence, which came as early as August 15, and one didn't have to wait for 1948.
A great diplomat, I must say, because, No,
Mountbatten actually, in his own autobiography, through his secretary, Campbell Smith, he actually began to believe, and I think due credit has not been given to Mountbatten again for our independence. And that is why I believe that it is Nehru, then Mountbatten, and then Sardar Patel. It's a relay run. The baton is passed by one to the other, and then so on. Mountbatten, in all his own private conversations, in his autobiography, in Johnson's writing, everywhere, he wants to take credit.
Yeah.
Please understand, Mountbatten has always wanted to take credit for this, and perhaps rightly so, because he just crunched the timeline. He just abbreviated the timeline. And to do that while partition was on, please, let's understand, to do that while a country was being divided on two sides, because the partition of India is not the partition of India as most people think. Most people think it was. The partition of India is actually the partition of Punjab, East and West, and the partition of Bengal, East and West. The rest of India was never partitioned, please. And that is precisely why Nehru and people like Nehru and Patel did not want a Pakistan in the middle of India. Hyderabad, for instance, or Bhopal, if they had gone over, you couldn't have that situation. So you would have had a Pakistan, an East Pakistan, a South Pakistan, and that would mean balkanization of India. And that is precisely what Nehru, Mountbatten, obviously, and Patel stymied. They stymied this. They didn't stall it. They actually stymied it. They crushed this. And that's why you have an India which looks like this today.
But that would have been, I mean, I can't imagine,
You can't imagine. Absolutely. Even I can't imagine.
Yeah. I mean, in the chapter Darbari Oligarchs, you have talked about, it's a very quirky chapter. I mean, one of my favorites, to be honest. And you have rightly, I mean, in the whole, if I can mention a plot, I mean, of course, there's a flow to a non-fiction book as well. This came at the right moment because, I needed this because after the introduction and, everything, this chapter is particularly quirky and wonderful. I could also relate it with, if you see a book at the back, the Captain Amrinder Singh book right there. So Bhupinder Singh of Patiala is also mentioned there. So Absolutely. It was wonderful to, kind of make a connection. You've talked about these Maharajas and what were their shocks? I mean, they were like...
Their idiosyncrasies are way beyond what we can think and imagine. Beyond what an ordinary individual can even think of or imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I was telling my wife about that what kind of, how many wives these guys had, the Nizam of
Hyderabad. I mean, absolutely.
So she was like, don't read this book. So tell us more about why, I mean, they were trying to, preserve all this, and who wouldn't, I mean, a lot, and there were only some, who wanted to kind of, they were thinking about the bigger picture and they knew that, I mean, they'll have to, exceed.
Actually, the role of Maharaja of Bikaner and Maharaja of Patiala is vital in this because it is the Maharaja of Bikaner along with Maharaja of Patiala who created a communal cleave within the Chamber of Princes and brought all the Hindu princes together and convinced them. Actually, there's a top secret of that time document which was left for me by my grandfather. The point I was making is that Maharaja of Bikaner was very, very crucial at a particular point in time because within the Chamber of Princes, through that missive that he circulated, he convinced the Hindu princes to join the new Union of India, to become a part of the Constituent Assembly, so that the digestion and assimilation of these princely states could take place. And the Maharaja of Patiala supported the Maharaja of Bikaner. And both these Maharajas, I have recorded their work through this book. And it is wonderful to have this sentiment, because the prevailing sentiment within the Chamber of Princes, guided by His Highness Hamidullah Khan, the Nawab of Bhopal, along with the Nizam of Hyderabad, the Maharaja of Travancore, and the Prime Minister of Kashmir, representing Maharaja Hari Singh of Kashmir, was that there should be a balkanization which would result in Princestan. And to my mind, the role of both Bikaner and Patiala is very, very important in that context. Let's also understand that Nehru was a very, how should I put it, a very strict anti-monarchical sort of person. And if you look at his rhetoric in the run-up to independence, the fact that he was incarcerated by the Maharaja of Naba, and he had an extremely tough time, and he was actually whisked away by Motilal Nehru, his father, because he was having such a difficult time in prison. All these happenings are very, very important in the context of our freedom movement. And I don't think there is enough record of what actually transpired.
Yeah. In fact, I think this is mentioned in the book also, that he was in prison for about, in entirety of like 10 years at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. He spent 10 years. He spent 10 years of his life in different British prisons. Between 1939 and 1945, which is the Second World War, the British more or less imprisoned the entire Congress leadership. He, along with several others, was imprisoned in the Ahmednagar fort. Gandhiji also was imprisoned. Sardar Sahab was also imprisoned. But 10 years of his life, he was in British jails. And mind you, I don't think he gets enough credit as a literator. He wrote several of his seminal books while he was in prison. Whether it was, I think, Discovery of India was written while he was in prison, and several other of his really seminal works were written in prison. So imagine, of his lifespan, 10 years were in British prisons. Some amount of time was spent in the prison of Maharaja Naba. A short time was spent in the prison of Maharaja Kashmir in Domel. And these things, rankled in his head, and he always believed that these princes were leeches, and the people under them were living in subjugation and serfdom. And that is why he wanted democratization. Actually, the freedom movement and the role of the princes and the way they conducted themselves, the way they tried to stall the independence movement, I think that is the first sense of democracy that comes in this country. Because remember, we had 200 years of British rule. Independence came in 1947. But this process of democratization, which Nehru ushered, contrary to Gandhi's opinion, again, this is a very important facet in this book, that Gandhiji never wanted the princes to be disturbed, because he believed that the princes represented trusteeship, the concept of trusteeship. And he didn't want them to be disturbed. It is Nehru who kept pushing the envelope. And of course, Sardar supported him. And surprisingly, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose also supported him in his endeavor to free India from the yoke of these princes. And he created an entity called the All India States People's Conference, which he used as a stalking horse. Even as the Congress was not allowed by Mahatma Gandhi, he used AISPC to go deeper and deeper. Mysore's example I've given you. Kathiawad, the role that they played in Kathiawad, I have mentioned. So these congressmen, Naba, it is Gyani Zail Singh who was at the head of that movement against the Maharaja of Naba. Gyani Zail Singh, then he became president of India. So a lot of these figures, seminal, iconic, then began to play a role in independent India. But I must confess that I studied economics.
I was about to ask you because I know that
for me, history is completely alien, beyond ICSE and ISC and the history that one consumed there. History was an alien subject, and now I am, this deeply immersive experience of history. It's become some sort of an obsession now.
It's wonderful, because a lot of us, later on in life, we don't want to, go out of our comfort zone, really. If we read books for a living, or if we are an engineer, we don't want to go out of that. It's a great achievement, and it's an example, especially for the youngsters, the millennials. Anything is possible. Just go for it.
But I'll tell you one thing, history, and it's, when you immerse yourself in history, and you go deeper, granularly into history, it is an amazing thing. And I want to lay stress on this, that we have not spent enough time as a nation. And I'm saying this with great modesty. I don't think we spent enough time as a nation to understand what our freedom movement actually was, its content, its construct, its architecture. I think a whole lot of invisible, faceless people have given their lives in this. If today we are free of the yoke of tyranny, if today we are free of subjugation and serfdom, it is because of these people. I mean, there are names like Nehru and Patel, etc. But there are people like VP Menon who I don't think it got enough credit for the kind of work that they did in terms of integration. Even his own tome on the integration of the princes is a very dry sort of book, which doesn't really flesh out what exactly happened. You know, the machinations, the subterfuge, the conspiracy, the way these princes conducted, the role of the British political department, where this, as Nehru would say, rogue called Sir Conrad Corfield represented, the role of the residents in all these British, these princes, which were essentially ruled by the British. It was completely diabolical. And if you see
and the back channel of Churchill, I mean, you have mentioned Churchill.
I mean, that's another amazing story. That Churchill, despite having lost the election to Clement Attlee, surprisingly, decides to use Wavell and Jinnah to conspire and create a new India out of India and Pakistan, and says that let's keep a bit of India. This I'm quoting Churchill verbatim. Let's keep a bit of India, which means that these princes would continue to be ruled by the British Crown and remain embedded within the Union of India. I mean, it's a staggering thought, but it happened.
Yeah.
And Jinnah's own Machiavellian role, the fact that he used the Nawab of Bhopal, he promised him the Governor Generalship of Pakistan, that if you will succeed, I will make you the first Governor General of Pakistan. All that, of course, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. It didn't happen.
Yeah,
and I think it is. I think we need to give due credit to all these founding fathers who fought their way. Because again, I want to lay emphasis on this, that there is a partition which is in progress.
True.
And effective October 26, there is virtually a war in Kashmir. And within that, we are doing all this. So imagine the bandwidth of these leaders. Imagine the bandwidth of a bureaucrat like VP Menon. Imagine the bandwidth of these people who brought India together.
We didn't even have emails back then. So, I mean, if they had emails, it would have been...
So the actual independence, it's a very good point that you raised. The actual independence, it is Lady Edwina Mountbatten who tells VP Menon that Mountbatten is in Shimla, he is resting, but Nehru has also gone to Shimla to rest. I think and suggest that you go immediately. Now remember, this is 1947. So Menon makes the trek to Shimla. Even today, it takes about 7 or 8 hours to get to Shimla from Delhi. Even today. So imagine back then. So he goes to Shimla. There is a Dicky Bird plan, which I mentioned, which is the Mountbatten plan, which Nehru is completely opposed to. And Mountbatten himself is not completely convinced that this is the right thing. Menon goes to Nehru, fleshes out that blueprint, goes back to Mountbatten, fixes it, removes all the glitches, as it were, goes out and calls up Sardar Patel, who himself is recuperating somewhere, and says that I have spoken to Nehru, I have spoken to Mountbatten, and we've worked out the contours of what could be the actual independence plan. Patel asks VP Menon, are you convinced that this is good to go? He says, yes, this is good to go. That is the independence. It is Edwina Mountbatten, Lord Mountbatten, Jawaharlal Nehru, VP Menon, and Sardar Patel. These are the dramatis personae. And look at their selfless service to this nation. That even when they were resting or convalescing, top of mind was how to go about getting independence.
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes feel bad. I mean, because these WhatsApp that are going around, and on page 60, you have mentioned a very short paragraph about Edwina Mountbatten, and it's kind of, you have to read between the lines, and you mention it. So it's, would you like to read it for everyone?
Oh, very much. And this, mind you, has been written by Nehru's own biographer, Frank Moraes. So you have to give it complete credibility.
Of course, yeah.
On Nehru particularly, Edwina Mountbatten made an immediate impact. She sensed that what Nehru most wanted and did not know how to achieve was to relax. And in the coming months, at the height of many tense, grave crises, she was able to coax him into a few moments of relaxation. In company or along with her husband or daughter or by herself, more than any other person, she was able to soothe his strained, tired, overwrought nerves. And Nehru soon found in her an understanding and intelligent companion, able to reinforce some of his views to persuade him away from others, to take his mind momentarily from the things which obsessed or irritated him, a companion always willing to help, but never to intrude. I think this is a dramatic passage, and I think it says everything that we are now aware of as far as the relationship between Lady Edwina Mountbatten and Jawaharlal Nehru is concerned. But let's also understand that if it was not for Edwina pushing BP Menon, the Dicky Bird plan would probably have been the independence plan.
Yeah, but that plan wasn't good. Not at all.
And in fact, if you go to the next para where Mountbatten's own biographer and his, I think, secretary, Alan Campbell Johnson, much later on 27 May 1997, gave a wonderful interview to Amrish Devanji. And in this interview, he says, the independence of India was unique. It was a battle fought on the principles of non-violence, led by a man whom today many consider a saint, Mahatma Gandhi. Yet what was largely a peaceful struggle for independence ended in brutal bloodshed as the new nation was divided into two countries along religious lines. Hundreds of thousands, blah, blah, blah. And then towards the end, he says that Lord Mountbatten, for trying, fingers were pointed at London for its callousness when this was happening. But more specifically at the man in charge, Lord Mountbatten, for trying to rush things and thereby causing bloodshed. Campbell Johnson strongly disagrees. We did not leave too early. Even the slightest delay would mean leaving too late. Now, these again are very, 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 words chosen very selectively. When Mountbatten accepted the assignment, the tentative date was June 1948. But on reaching India in March 1947, he found that 1948 was too far. It would have to be the same year. The sooner, the better. Delays would have caused greater mayhem, not less. Many of Mountbatten's critics do not understand that Mountbatten's task was a political one, not administrative. His job was to find a solution to the transfer of power. And once a political settlement had been reached, the administrative consequences became clear. I think these two paragraphs sum up what I've tried to achieve across this treatise.
Tell me something. Let's talk about the family, because it is integral to this book, and you have acknowledged that at the end of the book, of course. Let's talk about your grandfather and your father. Your father's name was Jawaharlal. Is he still?
So my grandfather, like so many other people at that particular point in time in India, was so obsessed with the iconic stature of Nehru.
Yes.
And being Kashmiris, he actually named his son Jawaharlal, not just Jawahar, but Jawaharlal. And that my dad, as he told me, that he was named after Nehru.
Yes.
So my grandfather was one of those invisible men, nameless, faceless contributors to India's independence movement. There are many things that he did. His blue eyes held many secrets, but he never, and I was one of his favorite grandchildren, he never, ever discussed what he did. Wow. He never, ever discussed his politics. He was OSD to 3 different prime ministers, to Panditji till 1964, to Shastriji beyond that, and then with Mrs. Gandhi till Mrs. Gandhi died. But never did he discuss his politics or what he did. It is whatever anecdotal evidence that I have of that time and the work that he did comes from my father, because he participated virtually in what was going on. Because people don't realize that Jawaharlal Nehru, as Prime Minister of India, did not live in Teen Murti Bhavan from the beginning. Teen Murti Bhavan was the commander-in-chief of the British Empire, Sir Claude Auchinleck's residence. Yeah. It is only much later that Nehru shifted to Teen Murti. Before that, he lived in 17 York Road. Okay. And Nehru had two trusted Kashmiri lieutenants, young Kashmiri lieutenants. Yeah. One was Dwarkanath Kachru, again, whose role needs to be mentioned. He was a great patriot, a great nationalist, and he contributed greatly to this country's independence. Unfortunately, he died at a young age in a plane crash in 1950. And the other was my grandfather. Okay. My grandfather actually lived in the outhouse with his family in 17 York Road. Oh. So my father used to potter around in the garden, and there are enough pictures to substantiate all the stories that he's told me. Unfortunately, we didn't use some of those pictures. We didn't use any of those pictures here. Maybe in the concluding part of my trilogy, I will use
Why not? I mean, that would be great.
Yeah, those pictures are sensational pictures because the story, as it goes, is that Pandit Nehru would come out of, and there was no security and all this, hoo-ha which exists today. So Nehru would come out of his house, find my father playing in the garden, and would say, Jawahar, this is Jawaharlal Nehru saying, Jawahar, kya kar rahe ho? So my father he's an 11-year-old. So he says, nahi, aise hi kuch khel raha hu. So he says, nahi, aaj Sardar Sahab ki ek takreer hai. Unne bulaya hai. Aur wahan hame jana hai. Tum aa jao mere saath. So I have a picture which is unbelievable. There is, when he reaches this takreer, Sardar Sahab says, no. You speak first. I will speak after you. Right. And the picture shows Jawaharlal Nehru speaking, Sardar Sahab sitting next to him, and my 11-year-old father sitting at Sardar Patel's feet.
Wonderful.
So it is those kind of memories, and that is why I thought that it is not just to dedicate this to those people who contributed to India's independence, but also equally to my grandfather, who never ever said anything about what he did, but he obviously played an important role.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how there are some people who just are so tight-lipped about everything that they do. Because, I mean, in this day and age, I mean, the day of Instagram and social media.
Imagine now where everybody wants to reveal everything that he does, and voyeurism is wide open. Yeah. You had people who simply did not open their mouths.
Tell us more about the Blitz, expose, which you have mentioned in the book. That will give context to everyone who's watching. And of course, they are going to read the book and give their feedback as well. That, what am I kind of referring to? And why did it mean something in the entire context?
So all, maybe not all, but several of these cuttings exist even today. And I must give credit to my mother, who has kept this repository, this treasure trove of information, of documents, of, aid memoirs, all sorts of things. And she's kept them. Yeah. 75 years later, they're in pristine condition. Yeah. None of them has even been attacked by silverfish. All those documents, they're there. Letters written by Nehru, by Patel, by Sheikh Abdullah, by Mountbatten's own aid memoir to the team that represented India at the United Nations when India unfortunately broached the subject of Kashmir. Yeah. And it is not Nehru who suggested this. It is, let me correct history, it is Mountbatten who convinced Nehru that he should go to the United Nations on Kashmir. That original aid memoir is with me. Yeah. The original Maharaja of Bikaner letter where he convinces the princes is again with me. Now, till 1946, my grandfather was the chief of bureau in Delhi of what was a very important newspaper of the time called the Blitz, which then fell away. So he wrote these sensational exposés, and I have read some of them. They're all written in first person. Okay. I can't simply imagine a journalist writing in first person, not on the edit page, mind you. Yeah. These are all front page exposés.
Right.
So it says, the cuttings are there with me. So it says, by K.N. Bamzai, Chief of Bureau, Blitz, Delhi. Yeah. And then he says, I asked Mountbatten. Yeah. Mountbatten in response said, I asked Patel, I asked Nehru.
Wow.
So Nehru was very smart. Kachru was his personal secretary, and he used my grandfather till 1946 as a journalist to get information. So the Churchill bit is an expose by my grandfather. The Maharaja of Travancore's deal with the British, where he gives them thorium, where he promises them thorium in turn for independence, again is an expose done by my grandfather. And mind you, Nehru, he gave those papers to Nehru. Nehru says, don't write it. Nehru says, wait. Then there is a Congress session. Nehru then goes to the podium at that national session and tears Travancore apart. The next day, the expose appears in Blitz. So all these exposes, the postbox number in London, where letters were sent by Jinnah for Churchill, all these exposes are there, and it's such a, I mean, as a journalist, forget the fact that he's my grandfather, as a journalist to connect the dots, to write the story, and you mentioned a very important word at the outset. Yes, it is non-fiction, but I wanted to build that plot.
Oh, yes.
The same kind of plot that existed to scupper India's independence. And I think somewhere, I don't know whether I've succeeded, but somewhere I've attempted to write it in that manner. But when you write history, you have to write history. You cannot write this as a fictionalized account of this would be sensational.
But did it go in your head? Because I was speaking to my wife about this, that maybe a spin-off. But did it go in your head, like,
No, I think the primary objective of me as a writer, as a journalist, would at the moment be to present history.
Right. Okay.
I think that is the first thing that I need to do, to correct history.
Yeah.
See, there is this vile revision of Nehru.
Yeah.
I have tried to correct that vile revision because I think he needs to be given due credit.
Yeah.
I think VP Menon needs to be given more credit than he ever got. I don't think he got enough credit.
Yeah.
The concluding part of this trilogy is a book that I'm working on right now, which is again written in the same manner. Through the prism of 5 individuals, I will present Kashmir.
Okay.
Between say 1920 to 1943, 1953, when Sheikh is actually arrested in Gulmarg. Yeah. So that book I have.
I wanted to ask.
I'm attempting to write that, and I've called it tentatively Kashmir, the Gilded Cage. Okay. And I view that book through the eyes of Nehru, Sheikh Abdullah, Maharaja Hari Singh, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and a very important player in Kashmir at that time called Ramchandra Kak, who was the Prime Minister who flirted with independence.
Yeah, I think it's a natural progression because
it is.
I felt like, I wanted to know more, and of course I wanted to pose the Kashmir question, but I'll leave that question for the next book because, it will be answered quite aptly.
Yeah, it is. It has all the detailing. Yeah. It has extensive and exhaustive research, and it has some amazing information which is hitherto not known, just as what I presented in this book. It is after this that I may attempt fiction, because it's very easy to write fiction, believe me, after this. Yeah. Because when you do deep dive, immersive sort of research, it is very, very exhausting.
You can't go wrong. I mean,
no, you can't go wrong. And in a book like this, now it's out. This is probably the 13th virtual thingy that we're doing on this book. Yeah. Nobody has faulted any part of history that I have confronted them with.
I mean, there are some people, there's one odd voice, who comes in and this is propaganda, and maybe on Amazon you get this review. I mean, social media is like that. I mean, Amazon is also like that. So what do you say about that? What do you say about that?
Propaganda, I would probably laugh it off like I am laughing it off right now.
Okay.
Where does propaganda fit into all this?
Yeah.
Test me on history and test me on every detail that I have in this book.
Yeah.
Nobody can fault me on what I've done. Right. Believe me.
Awesome. So I mean, I just wanted to ask you because I came across something and I was like, okay, I had need to complete.
You'll always get those kind of reactions, but I disregarded those reactions completely.
True.
And I think it is very important that Indian history, and particularly the period of the independence and freedom movement, which needs to be thrown into stark relief for the simple reason that the Congress party, unfortunately, created a left-leaning history narrative. And I am not, and that is the same left-leaning narrative that all of us have studied in school and even in college. People who have studied history, it is all left-leaning narrative. I think this is, as far as I'm concerned, this is a truly balanced narrative, not left-leaning at all, of what actually transpired as far as the princes were concerned.
I think everybody should read the book first and then post the review. And then post the review. Don't just go there.
Just for the sake of writing something is very easy to say and do and write whatever you.
So, I mean, my final question, of course, you are very busy, with everything that's going on in your life. You're writing, you are in a capacity which doesn't allow you a lot of time. But do you get a chance to read other books? I mean, there are so many in my background also. But do you get a chance?
I was a big, voracious reader of books. And if you visit my home and my other home, you will find there are books all over the place. I still try and find time to read, but I do not get time. One, on and off, I'll probably read a Dalrymple or something that fascinates me. But for this particular book, I read all of Nehru's biographers. And nowhere did I find this nugget of information, the role that Nehru himself played as an anti-monarchist. And I think his Fabian socialist outlook was something that pushed him to becoming an anti-monarchist. And he believed that these princes were living a life of luxury and the masses under them were living in subjugation and serfdom. And I think it was vital for me to present that part of the narrative, which again, left-leaning historians have missed out altogether. So, which is shocking. So if it's an oxymoron. If the Congress controlled our history, which it did, believe me, because all these left-leaning historians, I don't want to name them, and I read several of them while writing this book. And in fact, to write the earlier book on deconstructing the accession, also I read a lot of people who had written books on Kashmir. These strands of thought and these narratives do not exist. So if you read Sarvapalli Gopal or you read Frank Moraes or several of the other biographers, Patel's, I think it's Maniben, the books that have been written on Patel, nowhere do you find this strand of thought. And I sincerely believe that the role, and it's actually like clockwork, the role and the race that Nehru, Mountbatten and Patel ran. The Olympics are 4 days from now. This is a unique relay race. It has 3 individuals, 4 actually, because Menon has been discounted by history, and I think I give him some credit in this book. It is Nehru, Mountbatten, Patel, and then the last 100 meters are run by VP Menon, because he brings in the princes, he convinces them, coaxes them, corrals them, threatens them even at times to bring in all those princes, to go to Orissa, to go to Kathiawar. And remember, there are only a few planes that are flying about. Basically, it's all train travel, and he relentlessly and remorselessly goes after all these princes and brings them into our fold. And that is how you have the Union of India.
And my final question, the relationship between Sardar Patel and Nehru. I mean, you have also quoted a kind of conversation that we'll always be a team. And this is the kind of talk and, relationship they have. I mean, there is, of course, outside noise. And then also, now it has become a national, kind of. It's
of course.
Discussed over.
I won't categorize it as dissonance or friction. Okay. But there were always issues between Patel and Nehru. Okay. And these issues, I'll give you an example. The same 17 York Road that I mentioned, on October 26th, VP Menon, along with who becomes General Sam Manekshaw later and is, I think, then only a colonel or a brigadier, and who accompanies Menon to Jammu to get the instrument of accession signed. Menon flies back in a Dakota those days, along with Manekshaw, comes to 17 York Road, where the defense committee is meeting. Sardar Baldev Singh is there, Sardar Patel is there, Nehru is there. Sheikh Abdullah is sitting in an ante-room, and Menon bursts into the room saying the bastard has signed it. This is confirmed by Larry Collins and Dominic Lapierre, who say that Menon bursts into the room saying the bastard has signed it. Nehru, even after the signature, vacillates.
Okay.
This is all. This is my father has related this entire thing, and it's there in the book as well. Nehru is not convinced yet, because the army has to be flown in. The raiders are virtually, they've burnt Mahura Power Station. They're virtually on the gates of, they stop in Baramulla and pillage the nunnery. They rape those nuns. They waste time. They're virtually on the gates of taking Srinagar. Maharaja Hari Singh has fled in the night to Jammu. Nehru vacillates, and it is Patel who says, Jawahar, Kashmir chahiye ki nahi chahiye? Jawahar, again it is, Jawahar, tumhe Kashmir chahiye ki nahi chahiye? So Nehru then relents. Sardar Baldev Singh, who is the defense minister, gives the go. And the green light is given, and the Punjab regiment is flown from Delhi in those Dakotas. Sheikh accompanies them. In this, Sheikh sends a small note to Nehru that now that the instrument of accession has been signed by Hari Singh, go, get ready. Nehru still vacillates. So it is always, there is this element of Patel and Nehru. It is said, of course it's not a part of this book, but it is said on the morning of January 30, 1948, when Mahatma Gandhi is assassinated, Nehru and Patel both go to Mahatma Gandhi in Birla House, and they have irreconcilable differences. And Patel, it is said that Patel tells Mahatma Gandhi that I cannot continue to work with him. But then Mahatma Gandhi is assassinated, and they patch up, and then unfortunately Sardar Sahab dies in 1950. So I think it's on issues, they always had differences. But as patriots, nationalists, and people who wanted a union of India as we know it now, an ideal as we know it now, I think both were on the same page. And I don't think we should harp on these issues, because both were extremely tall men. Both played enormous roles in our independence. And I think at one level, the story that I've told you about Nehru going to Patel's takreer, and then Patel himself saying, no, aap pehle boliye, main aapke baad bolunga. So there was always mutual respect, but I guess on several issues, mainly on Kashmir, there were always differences.
Great. Thank you so much, sir. I mean, great talking to you. All the book nerds out there, just pick up this book. You won't regret it. I mean, at least I haven't come across an account like this, a balanced account. As sir also said that, there are sometimes, it's more right-leaning or more left-leaning. It's completely balanced. You'll enjoy it and you'll come out enriched. That I can guarantee, which I felt. And, Baki, you decide and let us know. Let the author know, of course, on Amazon, everywhere. Thank you so much, sir. It's great talking to you. And
not at all. Most thankful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so
much. And I think it went very well. Cheers.
Thank you.